Hello, everyone, from wherever you are and whatever time it is. Thank you so much for joining us for this book discussion of Dr. Hedi Viterbo's Problematizing Law, Rights and Childhood in Israel-Palestine. I'm not going to say too much before I hand things over to our chair, Professor Laleh Khalili. My name is Tanzil, and I'm the co-director of one of the hosts of this event, the Centre for Law and Society in a Global Context. The event is also supported by the International State Crime Initiative and the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. Thanks also to Professor Simon Reid-Henry, the Director of IHSS, and Dr. Thomas McManus, the Acting Director of ISKI. Thanks also to our events manager, Gulsh Khatun, and to all of our fantastic speakers. If you'd like to find out more information about the hosts, I'm about to paste the links in the chat. I'll now hand things over to Professor Laleh Khalili, a Professor of International Politics here at Queen Mary, who will chair the proceedings for this evening.
Thank you very much, Tanzil, for that introduction. And thank you very much, Hedi, for asking me to be involved in this incredible evening. I have known Hedi for quite a long time, actually. I have had the pleasure of knowing Hedi for quite a long time, and I've seen this project from its inception and have been very excited about it. So I'm going to quickly run through the format of the program, and then I'm going to introduce everybody. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce all the colleagues that are on the panel, and then just quickly also say a few words about the book. Then Hedi's going to have a 10-minute overview of the book's arguments and themes. Then each of the three discussants, Lisa, Neve, and Sahar Francis, will comment for 10 to 15 minutes. Hedi will have a quick response, and then we'll open the floor to question and answers. Let me just mention a few words about the book. Now, in this book, Hedi Viterbo radically challenges our picture of law, human rights, and childhood, both in and beyond Israel-Palestine. He reveals how Israel, rather than disregarding international law and children's rights, has used them to hone and legitimate its violence against Palestinians. But Hedi also exposes the human rights community's complicity in this situation due to its problematic assumptions about what childhood means, its uncritical embrace of international law, and its recurring emulation of Israel's security discourses. Now, Hedi will talk a lot more about this before the end of the session. So I'm going to go on ahead and start introducing everybody, and I'll do all of the introductions at the beginning. Hedi Viterbo is a senior lecturer in law at Queen Mary. Previously, he was a lecturer in law at the University of Essex, a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at SOAS, which is when I got the pleasure of meeting him, a visiting scholar at Harvard Law School, and a visiting researcher at Columbia University. His research examines issues concerning childhood, state violence, and sexuality from an interdisciplinary and global perspective. In addition to his new book, he's also the co-author of the ABC of the OPT, a legal lexicon of the Israeli control over the Palestinian territory, which was published by the CUP by Cambridge University Press 3 years ago. After Neve, we're going to have Lisa Hajar speak. Lisa is a very old friend of mine, not old, but a good long friendship. Lisa is a professor of sociology at the University of California in Santa Barbara, and her work focuses mainly on issues relating to law and conflict, including military courts and occupation, torture, targeted killing, war crimes, and human rights, just a lot of grim material over which we bonded. Her publications include Courting Conflict, the Israeli military court system in the West Bank and Gaza, which was published by University of California Press in 2005, and Torture, a Sociology of Violence and Human Rights, which came out by Routledge in 2013. Her forthcoming book, which we're all eagerly awaiting, is The War in Court, Inside the Long Fight Against Torture, which will be published by the University of California Press next year. She's a founding co-editor of Jadaliyya, the online newspaper, and a member of the editorial committee of Middle East Report, among many other quite important editorial positions. The next person speaking is my colleague in law and also friend, Neve Gordon, who teaches international human rights and humanitarian law in the School of Law at Queen Mary. He's the author of Israel's Occupation, which came out in 2008, and a co-author of The Human Right to Dominate in 2015, and Human Shields, A History of People in the Line of Fire in 2020, both of them co-authored with Nicola Perugini. Neve was the first director of Physicians for Human Rights in Israel and is currently the vice president of the British Society for Middle East Studies, as well as a board member for the International State Crime Initiative, which was one of the sponsors of the talk tonight. Finally, last but definitely not least, is Sahar Francis, who since 2006 has been the general director of the Ramallah-based Ad-Damir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, a Palestinian NGO that provides legal and advocacy support to Palestinian political prisoners in Israel and Palestinian prisons as well. She's an attorney by training and joined the association in 1998, first as a human rights lawyer, then as the head of the legal unit. She's got over 20 years of human rights experience, including human rights counseling and representation, and she has been on the board of Defense for Children International in the Palestine section for 4 years, as well as on the board of the Union of Agricultural Work Committees. So we've got just an amazing group of people to be speaking. So at this stage, I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to invite Hedi to begin his little spiel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lale. I'd just like to start by thanking the Center for Law and Society in a Global Context and the International State Crime Initiative and the Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. And special thanks to Tanzel and Simon and Tom for organizing and hosting this event. And also special thanks to the three fantastic discussants, Lisa, Sahar, and Neve. So I'll start with a brief outline of the book, which essentially offers a rethinking of the relationship between state violence, law, human rights, and childhood. And while the book focuses on Israel-Palestine, it also provides broader insights, and it also draws some parallels and connections with other times and places. So my findings are based on hundreds of sources that I've analyzed over the last 14 years. And most of these sources haven't been examined before, and many of them aren't publicly available. In terms of the theoretical framework, the book takes an interdisciplinary approach, which brings together several bodies of scholarship, including critical legal theory, critical literature on human rights, and critical childhood studies. One group of sources I examine is Israeli military judgments. In fact, this is the first academic book ever to analyze Israeli military judgments. This fills a huge gap in the literature because the military courts are a central part of the Israeli legal system. Every year, thousands of Palestinians are prosecuted in these courts, including hundreds of children. And we're very fortunate to have Lisa on the panel, who published an outstanding book on the military courts. But Lisa's book doesn't analyze military legal documents. Instead, it's based on interviews. And Lisa also completed her research 2 decades ago. Since then, the military law has changed significantly, and so has the broader geopolitical situation. Now, one of the reasons for the scarcity of academic writing on Israeli military judgments is the fact that most of them are not publicly available, and Israeli and Palestinian law schools don't normally teach the Israeli military law. So scholars are left struggling not only to access these materials, but also to fully understand them. But the military courts are only one of the sites that are examined in the book. It also covers various other political and legal issues. For example, it examines issues surrounding preemptive technologies, torture, surveillance, and the use of human shields. It deals with issues concerning the restrictions that Israel places on Palestinian travel, and it sheds new light on the Israeli closure of the Gaza Strip. It's also the first book ever to examine legal discourses and practices regarding both Israeli soldiers and settlers. So these are some of the issues covered by the book. And across these contexts, the book shows how, as Lale mentioned, Israel doesn't simply disregard international law and human rights. Instead, Israel has pursued a much more sophisticated course of action. It's been increasingly using law and human rights to perfect, conceal, and legitimize its violence against Palestinians. And this is a theme that some of the panelists have also explored in their work. The book sheds new light on this issue by examining aspects that haven't been explored before, and also by drawing special attention to the way in which Israel justifies its conduct through the language of children's rights. These issues are not unique to Israel-Palestine. For example, in some of my previous research, I examined how other countries, especially the US, the UK, and Syria, utilize law to legitimize and conceal the use of torture. And I've also written on how the US and Israel try to hone and justify their actions by adopting each other's legal arguments. Now, the focus of the book on childhood is important in two respects. First of all, if we define a child as anyone under the age of 18, then half of the population in Palestine is children. But what the book also shows, crucially, is that discourses and practices that seem to focus on children are actually no less concerned with adults. And these aren't only adults that have direct responsibility for children, such as parents, teachers, or social workers. They also include other adults, such as Palestinian adults in Israeli prisons, or Palestinian adults who are killed by Israeli airstrikes, or Israeli soldiers who are formerly adults, but are often conceptualized in Israel as children. Now, the book is highly critical of Israel, but at the same time, it also criticizes the dominant language and mechanisms of human rights. So, for example, it reveals how they promote ideas and agendas that are conceptually limited, factually inaccurate, and politically problematic. For instance, I show in the book how the rhetoric of children's rights is harmful to the Palestinian children that it claims to serve. It exposes them to greater harm, it disempowers them, and it also often misrepresents and even ignores their voices. But the children's rights discourse also harms Palestinian adults. It legitimizes apathy and even punitiveness towards these adults, especially if they're men. The book demonstrates how the human rights community is implicated in all of these issues. And this includes NGOs, both local and international, UN bodies, and some scholars who write on Palestinian children. For example, the book reveals how these human rights actors pushed reforms that Israel implemented and that ended up harming Palestinians of all ages. And I can elaborate about this later if anyone would like to hear more. The book also shows how some human rights organizations describe Palestinians as a potential security threat. And in this way, they reinforce the Israeli security discourse. And in some of my previous work, I exposed parallels and connections with laws and policies in other times and places. One long piece I published a few years ago drew parallels with the removal of indigenous children in 3 other settler colonial countries, which are the US, Australia, and Canada. So the book builds on this earlier work while also developing it further. Now, childhood is one of the least problematized identity categories in the humanities and social sciences. We've come to question common assumptions about other identity categories, such as gender, sexuality, and race. But the category childhood is still usually taken for granted. There are many critical studies of childhood, but they haven't had nearly as much impact as critical studies of gender, sexuality, or racialization. So one of the starting points of this book is that childhood isn't simply a natural and pre-given category. Instead, law and human rights are deeply implicated in the social production of childhood and also of adulthood. Law and rights manufacture childhood and adulthood. They reinforce these categories, they negotiate or challenge them, and they weaponize them in multiple ways. So in the book, I examine how childhood is constructed by discourses and practices of law and human rights, and also how childhood operates as a mode of control and violence in various areas of life. But the book doesn't only deal with the state and the human rights community. It also brings to light various forms of resistance by ordinary Palestinians. So for example, it reveals how Palestinians trick Israeli authorities by lying about their ages. And there are many other issues I could mention, but I think I'll stop here. Lisa, Sahar, and Neve, I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Hedi. That was exactly 10 minutes. Perfect. Okay, can we go to Lisa next? Lisa, if you could take 10 minutes, please, to respond to Hedi's book.
So I am very grateful to be here with all of you. And Hedi, this opportunity gave me the opportunity to reread your important book. And I must say that the first time I read it, I felt, because I never think about children if I don't have to, but I was really felt that it was such a powerful and, to me, original critique. And I saw myself in that, sort of the human rights critics of Israel in terms of the taken for granted thing. And so I must say, I thank you for really, helping me see something important in the limits of my own thinking. So I'm just, and this book is so rich for those of you who are in the audience and haven't actually read it yet. I'm just going to I'm trying to think of what I was going to highlight. I just sort of randomly picked a few things, but I just want to say, this book, Childhood Trials, it presents a highly original, critical, legal analysis of Israel's occupation, centering on children and juveniles. And one of the things that struck me, particularly as Hedi just said in his opening comments, really centering on the Israeli military courts, and he does innovative work. And it's really depressing to see that, well, he says, and indeed some things have changed since the time when I did my research in the 90s and very early 2000s, how many things still sadly remain the same. But Hedi demonstrates how political, legal, and ethical norms about childhood, including really the presumptive innocence of youth, are banished from Israeli security policies and military practices towards all Palestinians. So not only does he show how children and youth are treated in courts and prisons, but also how Israel's constructions of danger, terror, threat, and presumptions of guilt capture and ensnare Palestinian children. But what is so original about the book is that he also really problematizes childhood, including that very humanistic notion that Israel deprives Palestinians of their childhood. And so he problematizes childhood in such an interesting and innovative way, and specifically about the ways in which the age line has deleterious effects on children and on parents, or people across the age lines. So for example, one of the examples he gives in the book is, in terms of the military courts, is how youth may be an aggravating factor in decisions about how to treat or punish Palestinians. So Hedi's research, quote, unearths substantial inconsistencies in the implementation of statutory requirements to teach young age as a sentencing consideration. So for example, some judges regard youthfulness as a mitigating factor in sentencing, which is, sort of a common thing, I would imagine. Whereas for those who've crossed the 18-year-old threshold, age becomes an aggravating factor. So that line actually, then becomes a further basis for punishing more harshly anyone who's crossed that, somewhat arbitrary line. But then there are those judges that he's found in different sentences he reviewed viewed who regard those who are close to 18 as, quote, on the verge of adulthood, and then treat that as an aggravating factor, or they ignore the mitigation of youth. And so in some ways, you know, what he demonstrates in very ample ways is that harsh treatment by state agents and strict sentences are framed as necessary punishments for bad behaving kids. And the book is full of examples of this. But then there's the issue of the appearance of age. That is how the age that people appear to others. And so state agents often imagine that youth are not young, or that, and in those cases, for example, if soldiers shoot somebody, you know, and think that they didn't recognize that someone was a child, and that goes against their you know, classified operating procedures, then the soldier's word is accepted when they violate the state's laws about how kids should be treated. Moreover, because, as Hedi's research demonstrates, some Israelis see Palestinians as older than they actually are, and it feeds into the narrative that Palestinians can't be believed or trusted about anything, including their age, when belief is in the eye of the beholding state agent. And he also provides ample evidence and analysis of how age is a matter of life and death. So just as I mentioned, the rules of engagement are classified. And so therefore, when soldiers act, you know, according to these classified rules, and then might be themselves called up for some kind of disciplinary behavior, judges' biases, you know, which this is the old story, there's not anything new about that, to believe soldiers, however implausible or flatly wrong their claims are. And so that makes soldiers' perceptions of Palestinians' ages as determinative, to the extent that anything determines the use of excessive force in who to shoot. And then, of course, this is compounded by the culture of impunity for Israeli war crimes and other violations of the law. So rare is the occasion when Israelis are punished for harming or killing Palestinians of any age, and rarer still is the ability of court-ordered punishment to stick, since they're often commuted. So thus there's literally no protection for Palestinians, including but not limited to children, because harming them is framed as necessary, legitimate, or an understandable mistake by hardworking state agents who are trying to protect the legitimate community, which is Israelis. So one other thing I just would talk about, because Hedi and I actually did one small article on the issue of visuality, is his work in chapter 6 on sites of violence and childhood in the visual battlefield. And so he really probes in very interesting and complex ways in visibility and invisibility, in order to show, you know, sort of how this really operates in the broader context of Israeli policies of control. And he says, you know, he demonstrates how visual imagery has played a major role in reflecting and shaping notions of modern childhood in general. But so I want to just give a couple of examples of how this, that he uses about sort of the visuality of the invisibility. So one example is, he talks about in 2013, Israeli troops put up posters in a West Bank village featuring 4 photographs that apparently had been taken by the military at an earlier protest. And the pictures were of Palestinians between the ages of 14 and 17. And above each photograph was a heading, as he says in poor Arabic, warning that Israel, having already laid eyes on those visually captured in its photographs, would also lay hands on the Palestinians themselves. And it says, quote, "We are the military, we watch, we're out to catch you if we see you, or we'll come to your house." Similarly, another kind of way in which parenting and childhood, etc., is used were posters plastered around East Jerusalem a few months after those appeared, displaying photographs of 9 parents of already incarcerated youth. The purpose of this poster was not, you know, because those parents, their kids are already in jail, but it was actually by shaming them, it was a warning to other parents that if their children did arrestable things, they would be subject to this kind of shaming tactic. And so the poster reads, "If you do not want your photos to appear in a notice like this one, tell your children to stop the acts of aggression for the sake of their safety and future." And then one other example would be the policy to, you know, sort of deter kids from ever violating the law is just soldiers or whomever go out and just take photos of children who are not suspected of anything in the streets, and in that way builds files and archives of, quote, future terrorists. And just the last example sort of relating to this is this kind of surveillance in homes. As Hedi explains, it's part of the strategy of mapping. Israeli authorities create or acquire visual records and other information about households. And this basically occurs when soldiers break into the house and, at night often, and take photos of everyone, including children who are sleeping, or waking them up in order to photograph them. And the importance of children in mapping, as he notes, is because every Palestinian child was presumed a potential future terrorist. And that's why we have to know everything about them all. And so this, in that sense, those are just some examples. But to pull back and end my comments, I just want to say that the most significant aspect of the book, in my opinion, are the ways that Hedi advances a very holistic view of Palestinian society, in which taken for granted age lines are challenged in various ways. And one of them is, the policy of the 21st century policy of segregating prisoners by age, which he has a very fascinating discussion about the ramifications, the deleterious ramifications for both children and adults in prisons. And I would just say that the other aspect, that's really worth reading for anyone who is concerned about human rights and critiques of Israel, is to really take to heart Hedi's arguments about how human rights critics, by subscribing to the, the firm line between childhood and innocence and adulthood, end up, proactively or de facto legitimizing violence against non-children. So I just want to conclude and say thank you so much, Hedi, for writing this important book and making me learn so much about my own views, and sadly seeing that things have not changed nearly as much as I would hope.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for keeping to time as well, and for your fabulous examples and comments. Next, we're moving on to Neve Gordon. Neve, would you like to take 10 minutes, please?
Thanks, Lale. And Lisa, I think things have gotten much worse since you did it, not that they haven't changed. There's many parallels between what I've written and what Hedi and Lisa said, but hopefully I'll say one or two things that haven't been said. Hedi Viterbo's Problematizing Law, Rights and Childhood in Israel-Palestine is both a fascinating book and an outstanding scholarly accomplishment. In it, Viterbo deconstructs childhood, the law, court rulings, and the work of human rights organizations in order to expose how childhood has become a form of governmentality. Using Israel-Palestine as his case study, the analysis is based on 155 files detailing military court cases involving children to which Viterbo gained access, due, I think, to an archival fluke. The laws and decrees used both in the Palestinian territories and in Israel, scores of human rights reports, media coverage of certain court cases, and his intimate acquaintance with the political history of Palestine and Israel. In the introduction, Viterbo already notes that childhood is neither something that simply exists out there in the world, nor a natural category that is merely regulated by law and human rights conventions. Rather, the law and human rights are profoundly implicated in the social production of childhood. Viterbo is interested in the particular processes of social production and reproduction of childhood, how this concept becomes naturalized and normalized, and how it is mobilized to advance certain political objectives. He interrogates what the social production of childhood aims to achieve, analyzes the strategies used to accomplish these goals, and how these strategies affect the lives of Palestinians. Age is perhaps the most salient way through which childhood is produced and regulated. Human rights, for example, tend to conceive the number 18 as a watershed between childhood and adulthood. A series of characteristics are then attributed to over and under 18 groups. Under 18s are constituted as dependent, vulnerable, and lacking capacity. Over 18s as independent, responsible, and able people. These attributes are then naturalized through their very repetition in laws, rulings, human rights reports, etc. The law often adds a developmental dimension to the social production process, where, for instance, young people under a certain age cannot be held to be criminal liable, while young people over a certain age, say the age of 12, can be tried for criminal offenses. Yet the law also stipulates that 12-year-olds should be treated with a certain leniency compared to people over the age of 16 or 18. Such stipulations play an important role in constituting the subject, and Viterbo's analysis of how they operate helps elucidate the precise ways in and through which childhood functions as a tool of governance. So if mainstream legal and human rights approaches consider childhood to be a legal category which aims to protect young individuals, Viterbo highlights how childhood is also an instrument of management and control that can be used to repress the young people it claims to represent. In chapter 3, Viterbo reveals how in certain judgments, young age can actually serve as an aggravating rather than mitigating factor when sentencing Palestinians. Indeed, Viterbo shows how one Israeli judge justified a harsh sentence against a Palestinian child, claiming that it would deter other Palestinian youth from harnessing their innocence as weapons in the service of terrorism. In this judge's universe, sending a child to prison thus becomes an act of protection for other children. In another case, a judge used a different logic to justify the sentence he gave of Palestinian youth. He argued that Palestinian parents are weaponizing their children and therefore use the Palestinian child as a vehicle to discipline his parents. The logic is straightforward. If I send him to jail for a longer period, next time they might not allow him to protest. The cruel and twisted irony, namely that he himself might be the one weaponizing youth against adults, seemed to have escaped the judge. Indeed, reading case after case, it becomes very clear that the judges in military courts rarely, if ever, invoke the law to protect Palestinian children, needless to say, to empower them. Interestingly, Viterbo also shows how some judges underscore, wittingly or not, the constructed nature of childhood in their rulings by highlighting an ostensible discord between the age of the accused and his or her appearance, between the temporality and the materiality of the body. The utterance, he is 13, but looks more like a 16-year-old, can be used to deliver a harsher sentence. But even the opposite is true. A judge can claim that the accused is 16 years old, but looks more like a 13-year-old to justify a more severe sentence. According to one judge, a young-looking Palestinian was especially vulnerable to unwanted influences, and therefore, for the child's own sake, he ought to be kept in detention. Detain him to protect him is the underlying motto. While Viterbo stresses that deconstructing our understanding of childhood can be used to expose the exploitation of young people, as the Israeli case study underscores, it can just as easily be mobilized to violate and abuse them. So the act of deconstruction in itself that Viterbo used, sometimes the judges use in order to punish the children more severely. But Viterbo's arrows are not only directed against the military courts. He also criticizes the human rights organizations that take it upon themselves to defend children. One of the ways human rights organizations operate is by comparing national laws and practices with the requirements set out in human rights conventions. Laying bare discrepancies between the two allows them to underscore different forms of discrimination and abuse. With us this evening is Sar Francis, who will talk right after me. She's the head of the organization Adamir, who on its website points out that criminal liability begins at the age of 12 for Palestinians and Israelis. However, Palestinians under the military court system are tried as adults at age 16, whereas the Israeli justice system sets the age of majority at 18. While Israeli law and police orders stipulate that children detained in Israel are to be interrogated only by police officers specifically trained for the task, in the West Bank, Palestinian children are interrogated by police or secret security officers in situations that are extremely intimidating, lack any real form of oversight, and are rife with abuse. So this is Adamir. This comparative analysis is the bread and butter of human rights organization, and Viterbo, I think, is well aware of the significance of such analysis for exposing discrimination and violation. Yet he sets out to highlight some of the problems and shortcomings of human rights work. Viterbo shows, for example, how human rights reports continuously emphasize trauma in order to underscore that Palestinian children are at risk. Yet for the Israeli security forces, the fact that Palestinians are traumatized actually transforms them into a security risk, because in their minds, the mental illness might lead the children to carry out individual attacks against Israelis. This then raises the question whether the trauma discourse serves to protect Palestinian children or ends up constituting them as a threat. According to Viterbo, the mental health discourse is, however, just one of 4 frameworks that recur in human rights publications on young Palestinians. The other 3 revolve around the alleged loss of Palestinian childhood, that claim that young Palestinians deserve special protection by virtue of their supposed right to childhood, and the claim that human rights organizations represent the children's voices. Viterbo maintains that human rights organizations often fail to take into account the children's views. They affirm in their reports the provisions set out in human rights conventions.
Neve, wrap up.
Okay, take me about 2 more minutes.
Okay.
Even when the children which they represent reject these provisions and tell the human rights defenders that they prefer not to be governed by them. Consider the separation of incarcerated Palestinian youth from adult Palestinians. B'Tselem, for example, writes a report against the fact that Israel does not separate Palestinian children and adults, but in the same report, it cites a Palestinian child, and I'll read to you the testimony of the child. The Israeli soldiers took me and a 14-year-old friend to Ofer prison and put us all in a section which had 83 detainees of all ages. The detainees treated us well. They gave us candy, chocolate, and potato chips. I felt comfortable. A detainee helped me ask for the doctor to treat my leg. At first, I was afraid and cried sometimes because my family was far away. The adult detainees took care of me because I was the youngest detainee in the department, and they decided to make me an assistant to the detainee acting as sergeant of the department. Viterbo provides several examples of children testifying that they preferred being with adults, showing how human rights organizations often ignore this wish. He notes that despite occasionally taking the political agency of young Palestinians into account, the dominant human rights discourse disregards and downplays certain aspects of their experiences, highlighting instead the discourse of trauma, stolen childhood, and human rights, which ultimately silence the voices the NGOs profess to render audible. I want to end with two questions, Alale, so give me one more minute. First, I wondered how race plays into all of this, since it seems that the social production of Palestinian childhood is also racialized in concrete ways. We know that the accusation of adults weaponizing children is a trope used to cast people as barbaric, as lacking a basic ethical grammar. But are human rights, and especially children's rights themselves, also complicit in these processes of racialization? And if yes, in what way? Second, even if one agrees that the inventory of children's rights spelled out in a number of international conventions are used as instruments of governmentality that might not always benefit children, and if one also agrees with the line of criticism that human rights are racialized in certain ways to produce, or that they produce an individualized and atomized subject, can we afford to abandon the Convention of the Rights of the Child? Are, in other words, children's rights redeemable, to echo Ben Golder's question, or should we put them aside and produce alternative emancipatory discourses? I will end with these questions and thank Viterbo once again for producing an outstanding monograph. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neve. Sahar, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about this. So can you please take the next 10 or so minutes?
Yes, so good evening, and thank you for including me in this panel, Hedi. It's my pleasure to meet all of you. And it's really very interesting to listen to two scholars before me coming from the field, working on this issue for around 25 years now in the military courts. And believe me, Hedi, things are more complicated even from what you described in the book. But I liked a lot the analysis around the hyperlegality, about how you use the space and the age, and what's the policies behind the amendments actually that you're describing that took place in the last couple of years to the military system. I think I would highlight at the beginning, for those that they didn't read the book or they don't know enough about the military court system. When the Israeli occupation founded the military court system, immediately after the occupation, the same court system was applicable for all the Palestinian prisoners, children, adults, and all these differences between those less than 16 and those more than 16 were very minor things. And all the context of bringing the children to the same military courts in the same military with the same military judges and so on, the sentences were the same sentences. It doesn't mean that I'm in favor of this invention of the military court for juveniles at all. And this is why I liked your question, that it's really very rare that we hear it from the international community or from the Israeli colleagues and organizations dealing with violations on the level of prisoners. Instead of discussing whether these procedures are fitting to the international law, you should ask the basic question why the military court should at first arrest Palestinian children, and not just Palestinian children. Why military courts should prosecute Palestinian civilians, students, that they are active in their universities, laborers, why the Palestinian elected MPs should be prosecuted in front of a military court system. So actually, after all these long years of criticism against the system, and Lisa's book, but before also Lisa wrote her book, Also, other lawyers pointed to the problematic of this legal system that Israel is using in the military courts as an occupation against the Palestinian people. And we, like, lots of criticism were around mostly the definition of the crimes. What's the actions that would be considered under this system as crimes, and comparing them with the international humanitarian law, and whether this is this framework enables the occupiers to prosecute so many thousands, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, including children, under these military courts. So because of all this criticism, and it wasn't just the NGOs, the Palestinian or Israeli or international NGOs, it was, as you pointing as well, for example, the visitors, the international UK delegation, for example, that visited the court and issued their report about the situation, and much more from Amnesty and other international organizations, including UN bodies. Israel decided that it's the time to develop or amend these military orders, and this is when they decided in 2009 to invent the military courts for juveniles, and they did some amendments to the military orders. I don't think I would have time to enter into the details of these amendments, beside like the increase of the age and the invention of the court. It should be highlighted, and Hedi pointed it perfectly in his book, how all these amendments were kind of cosmetics, and it didn't mean anything at the end of the day on the level of more rights or more protections offered by the system to these children prosecuted. It was just in order to lift this pressure from inside and outside that we are trying to develop and make these military procedures in the military court are fitting to the international standards. Also, it should be highlighted a bit more than what Hedi pointed in his book, the issue of discrimination. Because Hedi, you pointed to the fact that what Israel is trying to do actually by these amendments is to make more similarities between the Israeli civil system and the military court system, and not just on the level of the children, but also on other cases, in like the adult cases in the court procedures. But still, it should be much highlighted that there is lots of discrimination even after these amendments on the length of interrogation, in the timing, when to, how long you can ban a child from meeting his lawyer, when you submit the charge sheet, how he can run his defense, the sentences, and all these issues. And this is not just annexation and preparing for legal annexation of the occupied territories, but this is apartheid. Like, even if they will consider the West Bank as part of Israel in the future, and these Palestinians would be residents in some way, they are still would be discriminated against. I liked a lot your analysis about the reasons why Israel actually is using these policies, and how they are using the fact of transferring the prisoners into prisons inside Israel to control the whole life of these child prisoners, with the issue of the family visits and the permits needed and the security restrictions that they can impose on family members before enabling them to visit, and how the legal standards of segregation between adults and children is actually affecting the rights of these children when it comes for psychological support, for education, for the experience, and how these adults were taking care of the children and how they were looking after them in the prison. But also, again, it should be highlighted that even if we will take the fact that Israel in these amendments enabled at some point, for example, to keep the teaching classes for the children under such a certain age, 16 years old, for example, they canceled totally all the high school, all the university education system that was offered in 2011, actually. And since then, the Palestinian prisoners developed their own system. They contacted the Palestinian universities and they have educational system, but it's secret. If the prison authority would know that they are teaching and having school inside the prison, they would punish them. And they did so against when they confiscated thousands of books and they punished the female prisoner. But you also were supposed to highlight the issue of the high school exam that is taking place also secretly, because Israel refused to enable the Palestinian Authority to take the high school exams. And since long years, it's canceled. And the prisoners do it alone with internal procedures that they developed in in agreement with the Palestinian education high school system. I wanted, Lali tells me that I still have just 2 minutes, so I wanted to jump to the last part of chapter 4 that I liked much about putting it in the correct context of to see how the increase of the age and the segregation and the military court system actually was intentionally used in order to maintain the control. How to think about the segregation that is implemented not just on the prisoners, but as well in the whole community between Gaza, the West Bank, 48, the West Bank, and how they categorize like my children and adults, but it's also on the whole society and how it's affecting every aspect of our daily life. Also, how you are connecting it to the fact that they are actually imprisoning the Palestinians' minds, not just the body, by trying to affect all this system that you described of education and teaching and the generational exchange of experiences. And finally, I just wanted to comment on the criticism about the role of the NGOs. In part, maybe you're correct, but I think we also cannot ignore the fact, and especially when you say that by highlighting the children, we ignored the adults. It's not correct. Like Damir for 30 years are trying actually to expose all the violations and the discrimination and the torture and all the crimes that systematically the adults are facing. I agree with you that for some level, maybe in the international arena, because of this anti-terror dialogue and conversation, people think that every adult prisoner is really a terrorist in the Palestinian context. And this is why we are avoiding ourselves from dealing with their rights. We don't want to talk about their right to education or about their right to health. Just if they are getting any hunger strike and becomes very serious case of human aspect of health, like to be dying under hunger strike, people would find interest on it. But it should be highlighted that the majority of the Palestinian prisoners are not convicted or imprisoned because of militant activities that could be considered illegal according to the international law. Thousands of students, political leaders, political activists, unionists are imprisoned. And this is why it's very important what we are arguing, that it's the time to discuss the system as as part, the military court system couldn't be treated as a justice system, neither for the children, neither for the adults. There is a serious problem in the system itself on the level of the jurisdiction, geographical jurisdiction, and the definitions of the crime, and not enabling fair trial standards. And this is why, for example, Damir is submitting complaints or dossier for the International Criminal Court, because not offering a fair trial procedures by itself is a violation according to the Rome Statute. Transferring the prisoners to prisons inside Israel as well is a war crime. Torture is a war crime. Using administrative detention in the
Sahar, sorry, can you wrap up?
Yeah, arbitrary detention is a war crime. So thank you, Hedi, for the book and for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Sahar. Hedi, would you like to take a few minutes to respond to some of the questions and comments that have been brought up? And then we'll open the floor to questions.
Sure. Thank you, everyone, both for your questions, but also I think you all in your different ways kind of did a fantastic job of helping me kind of convey some of what the book tries to do. I want to start with two questions that Neve raised. So Neve, you asked, first of all, you asked about whether we can afford to abandon, you asked specifically about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but more broadly, children's rights and maybe human rights, which is kind of a broader question that is not confined to Israel-Palestine, obviously. And I think in order to think about that question adequately, we need to fully understand the scope of the problem and the way in which it far exceeds the issues that we're talking about today. And it's not unique to Israel-Palestine at all. So in my teaching and current research, I'm interested in other contexts, such as, for example, what is called child labor, which is a term that is rejected by working children's movements in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, who actually resist the language of children's rights, which, among other things, seeks to ban child work. And they actually, they have their own agenda about child work. They want it to change, but not in alignment with the language of child rights. And the reason I mention that is because it's a very different context, but I think it highlights partly the scope of the problem. And I could mention endless other examples relating to child refugees, child combatants, child removal, which we know across the world disproportionately, child removal disproportionately targets families who are from like disempowered and disadvantaged communities, and historically has done so. And really, I mentioned in my presentation, I kind of alluded to parallels with Australia, Canada, and the US, but I also touched in some of my earlier work recently on, for example, what I think all of you mentioned, which is the generational segregation of Palestinians. So I also touched on how that's happening as we speak in China, in the region of Xinjiang, because Uyghur adults are being placed in internment camps, whereas their children are being placed in securitized schools in order to indoctrinate them into Han values. So I could give endless other examples, but I think there's a lot of work to be done in exposing how problematic child rights is. And I think a lot of fantastic work has been done in relation to human rights. But I think work on children's rights hasn't had the impact that it needs to have in order for it to kind of then lead to us considering, okay, to what extent can we afford to abandon it? I think there are some good elements personally in children's rights, in the dominant children's rights discourse, but I do believe it's problematic. And one of my future projects, which I know, Neve, we've kind of touched on in our own conversations outside this event, is thinking of alternative models. I don't have them now, so you'll have to wait, all of you. But it's certainly something that I'm passionate about and kind of I'm committed to. Which brings me to your other question about race and racialization and the complicity of human rights as kind of a field and a discourse in racialization. And I think part of what I was talking about now speaks to that, because if certain communities and certain children are abnormal, as is the case according to, as the book shows, as is the case according to human rights reports in relation to Palestinian children who are sometimes being presented as non-children effectively. So if these communities are abnormal, is there a racializing dimension there? What groups are get to count as normal children, and according to what standard? Whose standard is that? And part of the key contribution of critical childhood studies is really to expose how kind of culturally, historically contingent and biased the standards of dominant childhood and children's rights are. And obviously we're familiar with the same criticism in regards to human rights. So it's not just the fact that the language of human rights is atomizing and individualizing. It's that, but it's many other things, which I think the lens of childhood really exposes very kind of vividly. So I don't know if I've fully kind of answered your questions, but feel free to kind of ask follow-up questions if you have any. Sahar, you asked, your questions were more specific about the Israel-Palestine context. So one of the things you highlighted rightly, I kept nodding when you were speaking, because I think kind of I agreed with almost everything you said. So for example, you talked about the need to highlight discrimination and apartheid, which I fully agree with. I don't know if, I know that you focused due to time constraints on some parts of the book, but the last chapter actually talks heavily about that structural discrimination. The reason I left it to the last chapter is that I feel like in discourses about Israel-Palestine, apartheid and discrimination are at the forefront, rightly so. And what I try to do is kind of focus on less familiar, kind of expose less familiar dynamics. But certainly in the last chapter, I talk about, for example, how Jewish settlers who throw stones are treated. And then I compare that with how Palestinians who throw stones are treated. Or for example, and people in the audience who haven't read the book may not understand why we keep assuming that separating adults from children in prison is a bad thing, as the book shows, because obviously it's counterintuitive, but the book does show why Palestinians themselves don't necessarily benefit or want it, and how it actually serves the interests of the Israeli prison authorities. But one of the things I show in the last chapter is that when settlers were arrested after they opposed the Israeli pullout from the Gaza Strip, they weren't separated. The children and adults there weren't separated, which goes against the norm, the legal norm, because under the legal norm, children and adults should be held separately. And that was discussed in the Israeli parliament. And you could see Israeli legislators actually saying explicitly, we shouldn't separate them because they need this intergenerational support. So exactly the opposite argument of the one that was used to justify generational segregation in relation to Palestinians. And for those who haven't read the book, the argument there was that older Palestinians were basically radicalizing Palestinian children. And I saw a comment in the chat about some parallels with Prevent in the UK, which for audience members who are not from the UK, Prevent is basically kind of supposed to be a de-radicalizing government scheme that we as universities are supposed to enforce among other institutions. And we're supposed to prevent radicalization because God forbid university becomes a site of radicalization. And we know from studies that has been disproportionately targeted at especially Muslims, but also left-wing activities. So there are certainly parallels there. So that's the point about discrimination and apartheid. You also highlighted, Sahar, the importance of covert Palestinian resistance, and I fully agree with it. And I do try in the book to kind of bring bring to the forefront various forms of resistance. For example, in chapter 4, which you talked about, you probably remember that I talk about the smuggling of sperm, which is another instance where we see Israel trying to sever or to cut the generational continuity of Palestinian society, right, by preventing imprisoned Palestinians from having conjugal visits, which all Jewish and Israeli prisoners can have, including, for example, the one who killed former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. He gets a conjugal visit. His sperm is valuable, but the authorities don't want to allow kind of reproduction, both mental reproduction, as you mentioned, and political reproduction, and kind of physical. So one of the forms of resistance, which is a fascinating one, is the way in which imprisoned Palestinians basically smuggle sperm outside prisons into Palestinian clinics, which is a fascinating context. So I think kind of Palestinian resistance is really important, and you rightly mention it. In terms of your last comment about how focusing on children doesn't necessarily ignore adults, I partly agree. I think the key point here is that human rights organizations are not one thing. There's a lot of kind of disparity and kind of divergence among them. And I think Addameer, I actually mentioned Addameer as an example in a talk I was invited to give elsewhere a couple of weeks ago, is kind of a uniquely political kind of organization. And I remember reading in some of your reports actually using the language of colonialism very explicitly and drawing parallels, which you wouldn't often see necessarily in human rights reports. Some organizations which are afraid about funding wouldn't use that language. So I think
and we're paying the price, Hedi.
I've noticed. I've noticed. Yeah, yeah. I'm sure you can speak to that much more eloquently than I ever could. But I think I would say that Addameer is cited repeatedly throughout the book. There are certain framings by Addameer that I would be critical of. I don't think that that particular issue that you mentioned is one of them. But I do remember, for example, Addameer being mentioned in the context that Neve talked about of the trauma discourse and how that, some of the problems with that in chapter 5. So yeah, I think I have kind of, the book has a complex relationship with human rights organizations because it does heavily rely on the work of human rights organizations, which is extremely valuable and important, while at the same time trying to kind of bring to light the limitations and pitfalls that sometimes are the result of best intentions. So I think the book does both. It's not like, yeah, either or. Yeah, that's it, I think.
Great. Thank you, Hedi. And I think that those kinds of ambivalences that you're talking about on the one hand, acknowledging that these human rights organizations are doing things that nobody else is, and sometimes doing it at the expense of the kind of punishment that Addameer and the other 5 organizations are experiencing. But at the same time, obviously, we're scholars and we're always looking for those elements that we think within a larger structure perhaps generate contradictory outcomes. I won't speak very much because I want to invite the audience to ask questions. So please use there's a button at the bottom of your screen which should say reactions, and it has a raise hand button on it. It's at the bottom right. And if you're uncomfortable to actually speak out, you're also welcome to type in your question in the chat box. Again, the chat is down at the bottom of the screen. The one thing that I would ask is, please, if you're asking questions in person by voice, please try to make it quite brief so that others can also ask questions, and questions rather than comments would be preferable and welcomed. Anybody have any questions? Lisa says, can the screen be changed to all participants? Lisa, I think if you go onto the top and click on view and use gallery, that should put all the participants on the screen. Okay, Lisa actually has the first question. So Lisa, why don't you go on ahead and unmute yourself and
Okay, so thanks. This all has been extremely fascinating. Hedi, one thing that I had wanted to ask about, and you just kind of mentioned it in your comments, was this question of child combatants. So I'm assuming that the kind of status of Palestinians, and Israel's presence in the territories, like it's not conceived, it's like something other than war. So does the notion of child soldier bear on this particular context? And just maybe, and perhaps this is more for Sahar, is the issue of because Palestinians see their resistance not as acts of aggression, but as acts of survival and resistance. But the idea in international human rights law about the notion of the rehabilitative obligation on states who detain children who are arrested in the course of conflict. I'm just wondering if that bears at all in this context these days.
It's a really interesting question, and there are many different ways to answer it, but I'm also thinking of Neve's work, who's written, including very recently, on kind of the relationship between the civilian and the combatants, and why it's not a simple distinction in so many ways, and how it's been eroded, and what violence is kind of involved in the erosion of the categories. And in chapter 7, I speak about I speak about the issue of child combatants and human shields, which Neve has written about with Nicola Perugini. And I cite some of Neve's work in that context. So maybe I'll say about this, but a bit about that, but my answer won't be legalistic. So I won't be saying whether under international legal norms, these children count as combatants, because I'm not the kind of person to ask that question, not because I can't create that answer, but I think that's a bit kind of a limited way of having that conversation. But I think what you're asking about is a question that goes beyond kind of the way in which dominant legal thinking organizes these categories. And one of the things I talk about is how Israel tries to place, okay, let me start with that. I don't think it's useful to think of the Palestinians that I talk about as child combatants. Okay, let me just start with that. Okay. Maybe to prevent any misunderstanding. When I mentioned earlier child combatants, I was just mentioning that as kind of alluding to critical scholarship on child combatants and showing some of the blind spots of dominant discourses. For example, scholarship on child combatants has shown that there's an assumption that child soldiers are forced to join armed forces, whereas we know that for the vast majority of them, they're not forced. It doesn't mean that being in a military is a good thing, but it just means that the dominant discourse is problematic, and the dominant children's rights discourse has certain blind spots. But to answer your questions, I wouldn't say that they're combatants, but I do say in my analysis that Israel tries to blur that distinction by arguing, and this speaks to Neve's work, by arguing that children effectively are human shields. By their mere presence in Gaza next to sites of kind of Hamas, armed Hamas forces in Gaza, they effectively become human shields. And here I'm building on Neve's work, that effectively is supposed to become a sort of preemptive legal defense, right? Because then if Israel targets those heavily populated areas, and we know that the Gaza Strip is one of the most densely populated territories in the world, we know that for Israel, if it targets those populations, it thinks of that argument as a legal defense. And I highlight in my discussion, the fact that Israel itself has for decades, since at least 1967, has for decades been using Palestinian children as human shields. We know this, okay? So it's an interesting, it's a very problematic argument for many reasons, but among other things, Israel is the one explicitly using Palestinian children to shield its forces from Palestinian resistance. And I also show how many of the accusations Israeli state officials make against Hamas are no less applicable to Israel. For example, we know that military bases are in Israel located in centers of urban population, for example. And we know that Israeli childhood is heavily militarized from before the child is born, as I show, from the uterus, there's already a lot of militarizing discourses that then are intertwined with dominant legal discourses in Israel. So that kind of how I would answer your question. It's not exactly a legalistic answer, but I think it speaks to the use of the image of the child combatant in this seemingly non-child combatantist, that like context.
Great, thank you, Hedi. There is a question in the chat by Donya Mushtahedzadeh who asks, thank you to Hedi and the panel for this interesting talk. What do these discussions mean for children's rights instruments and provisions in humanitarian law protecting children, women, and etc.? Are they completely redundant, or is it still possible to use international legal structures to protect so-called special category groups without repeating Israeli state discourse or practice for that matter?
It will take me probably 2 semesters to use academic terms to answer that question, and I do that. I have modules, as we call them here, which kind of deal with that question. So I'll just give a very partial and somewhat superficial answer, which is that I think we need to think about the values that international humanitarian law and human rights law at their best are trying to protect, right? For example, if we think that human vulnerability is an important concept or like a value that needs to be defended, and we know that vulnerability has also been criticized, for example, in studies of migration and certain depictions of vulnerability. But if we think vulnerability needs to be protected, then I think kind of these clear-cut age thresholds don't fully do the work, unfortunately, and they also create some forms of vulnerability. So, for example, and I'm trying in my responses here to kind of broaden the scope of analysis to show how this is a much wider issue. I draw also in chapter 7 on work by Charlie Carpenter, who's written on the armed conflict in Bosnia Herzegovina. And she's shown how in that context, and again, this is about combatants rather than civilians, in that context, the special protection given to women and children, right? There's always this phrase, women and children, and that's a humanitarian legal phrase, how that rendered men more vulnerable, because men in situations of armed conflict, many forms of state violence are disproportionately targeted at men, such as certain forms of forced recruitment or arbitrary arrest and so forth. So I don't have a perfect answer yet, but certainly there are many problems. I'll just say that many problems with the existing framework that kind of create some of the problems it claims or it professes or it seeks to solve.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true about the military-aged male being a category that has been used across 100 years and multiple colonial contexts to suppress men, or to specifically pacify revolts. Any questions by anybody else? If not, would any of the panelists like to have a final word? No? In that case, I want to say thank you to everyone who attended, and I am extremely grateful to the Center and to the law school for organizing this, and to the panelists for being here across multitudes of time zones, from 2 hours before to 2 hours ahead to 8 hours before. And I'm very grateful to Hedi for having written this very exciting, really important book, and to all the panelists for their excellent presentations. Thank you so much, Hedi and Lisa and Neve and Sahar. Thank you, Tenzil, for organizing this, and Golsh for your excellent monitoring and arrangement and administration. Everybody have a very good night, and I hope I wish you all safety from Omicron. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.